Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today. As this is an incredible turnout, both in the room here and online. I know we've got over 60 people joining us remotely for this talk as well. So thank you so much for turning out to this event. My name is Liam Haggerty. I'm the campus administrator for the Touchemount campus of Vancouver Island University. We're located on Nootka Street, just a couple of blocks down Joyce. And the campus name, Touchemount, is an Ayajuthem word that translates as House of Learning. It was gifted to us in 2022 by Tla'amin Nation Executive Council, and we are honored to carry it. Before I introduce our speaker today, I want to remind everyone that today's presentation is being recorded by a documentary film crew. If you do not want to be recorded, please sit in the back row. Doesn't matter. You can't move now. So if you don't want to be recorded, if you want to make sure you're not recorded, you can make that known to Peg. Peg is right here. And so you can find her, and you don't need to talk to her ahead of time. You can talk to her at the end, and she'll make sure that you don't appear on camera without your consent. I also remind people to turn their cell phones off or any devices that might beep during today's presentation. Right. I want to begin by recognizing that we are gathered today on traditional territories of the Tla'amin Nation. I also want to recognize the processes through which these territories were transformed from Indigenous spaces to settler colonial ones. Dr. Carleton is going to talk about some of these processes during his talk, including the role that education has played in the attempted erasure of Indigenous identity and nationhood. As a post-secondary institution, if we are to support Indigenous sovereignty and to contribute to reconciliation today, we must acknowledge not only the land where we are, but our complicity in the colonial processes that have taken place here so that we can take the necessary steps to move forward together in a good way. Now to our presentation. I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Sean Carleton. Dr. Carleton is a settler historian and assistant professor, almost gave you a promotion there, an assistant professor in the departments of history and Indigenous studies at the University of Manitoba. His research examines the history and political economy of colonialism, capitalism, and residential schools. And education, including residential schools in Canada. He has held a number of fellowships during his career and is a regular contributor to the Globe and Mail, The Guardian, and other news publications. He is the author of Lessons in Legitimacy, Colonialism, Capitalism, and the Rise of State Schooling in British Columbia, which was published by UBC Press in 2020. And it was awarded the Canadian Historical Association's Clio BC Book Prize for the best book in regional history that year. Please join me in welcoming Sean. That's right.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Liam, for that very kind introduction. And thanks for the invitation to speak to you all today at the Public Library. I'm very honored to be here on the unceded and traditional territory of the Tla'amin Nation. And thanks to each and every one of you for showing up here in person, as well as those folks joining us online. It's great to see lots of you out. Taking some time out of your Saturday afternoon to learn more about the history and legacy of Israel Wood Powell. So the title of my talk this afternoon is Who Was Israel Wood Powell? Examining the origins of settler colonial rule in British Columbia. And in terms of an outline, here's what I'm going to be talking about today, so you know what's coming at you. First, to give you a better sense of who I am and why I do the work that I do, I'll begin by offering what's known as a position statement, as an explanation of my position and the relationship to the work that I have. Next, I'll briefly go over some basic historical information, just to give us a basic foundation, answering the question, who was Israel Wood Powell? Then the heart of my talk this afternoon will shift our focus to some of my new research, looking at Powell's connection to colonial schooling in British Columbia. And this is based on a new article I've written and that I've given permission to the website, The Name Matters. And it's up right now as a featured read, and you can read it. And I'd be happy to take any questions. Got my contact information here on the slide, and I've got it at the back as well. So you can send me an email if you want to have a look at that article and ask some questions about it. Finally, what I'm going to do is conclude by offering some thoughts on how we might reckon with Powell's legacy, and then open things up for discussion. Sound good? Okay, great. And before I begin, I'll note that I've taken care with the information that I'm going to be presenting today, but wanted to note that the talk does contain some historical language and details that might be upsetting, especially for survivors and intergenerational survivors of folks who went to residential schools or to day schools. So I've included the Indian Residential School Survivors and Family Crisis Line information there for you. And again, I'm happy to answer any emails if you need more resources, or perhaps debrief once the talk is concluded. Okay, to begin. I'm particularly interested in the history of British Columbia as a settler colonial society, because this is where I'm from, where I first learned to understand myself and my place in the world. This is Vancouver, British Columbia, as I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, which is the ancestral and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Coast Salish First Nations. I'm originally from North Vancouver, on the north shore of Burrard Inlet here. I grew up in what is known as Lynn Valley. Anybody been to Lynn Valley? Maybe the Lynn Canyon? Yeah. I went to Argyle, and I went to Westover Elementary, which I'll actually somewhat indirectly talk about in a second. And for those familiar with the North Shore, there are 3 reserves there. And then there's also the Kitsilano and Musqueam Reserve out towards UBC campus, for those familiar with the city. And this kind of settler colonial capitalist spatial organization has shaped much of my life and research interests. So my family lived near where the former Squamish Indian Residential School and Day School operated between 1890 and 1970 in the area of Lower Lonsdale, just here. And I passed by those sites a little bit up. Yep, okay. I know there's people all the way back in the hall. I'll try and speak to you as much as possible without hurting the eardrums of the folks in the front. So I passed by these sites all the time without knowing the history and ongoing legacies of those institutions for my Indigenous neighbors. I understood nothing about how settler colonialism more broadly created this, my home, very recently, and provided me with a number of privileges that profoundly shaped my life and that I mostly took for granted as commonsensical as normal. I did not think critically about my experience growing up as a settler until I attended university, where I took courses on the history of Indigenous peoples in British Columbia and learned a lot more. These courses and conversations with Indigenous students and professors helped me realize that much of what I had learned, formally and informally, had taught me to see this as normal, that it justified the process of colonization as natural and inevitable. It normalized the creation and ongoing maintenance of British Columbia's settler capital society as commonsensical. As I begin to learn how to question those lessons in legitimacy, I committed myself to a practice of unlearning and relearning how to live in a better way. As well, at the same time, I learned more about the history and ongoing legacy of Canada's Indian residential school system from a new family member, Patrick, a Kwakwaka'wakw survivor of the St. Michael's Indian Residential School at Alert Bay, which is off the northern tip of Vancouver Island. And through our conversations in a more relaxed, informal space around the dinner table, I started to understand more about the nature of schooling in colonial settings, such as British Columbia, historically, but also personally. And I began to realize how they prepared people like Patrick and I to take up very different positions in society. After many conversations about his experiences, Patrick gifted me a sacred bundle, including an eagle feather, which is a symbol of truth and leadership, and asked me to learn more about this history. But the gift was also a responsibility. It came with the expectation of ongoing reciprocity. Patrick wanted me to share what I learned with others to help put truth before reconciliation and create pathways for healing and justice so that future generations of Canadians like me could not grow up and say, I never learned about this. And I agreed. And over the past 15 years, my capacity as a professional historian, author of many articles and books, I've worked to honor that relationship and my responsibility. And I devoted my scholarly research to better understand the different ways in which different schooling projects for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, like Patrick and I, played complementary roles in supporting settler colonialism and the ongoing making and maintenance of British Columbia. And it is this path that has led me here today to speak to you folks about the legacy of Israel Wood Powell. So let me explain. In its 2015 final report, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada was very clear. We must establish the truth about residential schooling before meaningful reconciliation can occur. The TRC explains that the goal of confronting the complex truth about Canada's colonial past is not to fuel division, but rather to facilitate healing, justice, and reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, and repair the damage done through colonization. History, the commissioners remind us, quote, plays an important role in reconciliation. They say, to build for the future, Canadians must look to and learn from the past, even when it's difficult to do so. And this is a picture of the commissioners of the TRC, Murray Sinclair, the chair of the commission there in the front, releasing the TRC's volumes in 2015. Now, part of learning the truth about residential schooling is acknowledging that many notable figures, often celebrated in our old history textbooks in high school, people like Egerton Ryerson, people like John A. Macdonald, helped build Canada, but they also helped destroy Indigenous nations to do that. We learn the first part, we don't learn the second part. And part of that second part is playing specific roles in devising, deploying, and defending Canada's Indian residential school system for more than a century, between 1883, when the system officially gets started, to 1996, when the last school closes. As a result, and responding to volume 6 of the TRC's final report, which is freely available and you can read online, and calls on Canadians to rethink commemoration practices, people across the country are organizing to change or remove statues, rename streets, buildings, neighborhoods, and cities that, intentionally or not, celebrate the architects and defenders of Canada's residential school system. It's not just here, it's happening across the country. And contrary to popular belief, the residential school system was not only created by a few select architects in the East in Ontario. Church and state officials across the country, including here in British Columbia, played key roles in building and defending that school system to aid colonization and Canadian nation building. And this is where you folks come in. In this regard, the city of Powell River has acknowledged Israel Wood Powell's connection to colonialism in British Columbia generally, which is known to most historians, but isn't taught in high school, for example, and a lot of people don't know this information. So the city's website says, we recognize not everyone learned about the government's treatment of Indigenous peoples in school. I certainly didn't, as late as the 1990s and early 2000s. And we know it is important for you to make an informed decision about a possible name change. Here's some information about Israel Wood Powell and the policies he developed and implemented on behalf of the government of British Columbia and Canada. So this is on the city's website. I won't spend too much time going over this, but just to give us a good foundation, briefly. Israel Wood Powell, who was he? So Israel Wood Powell was born to an influential Great Lakes family in Ontario in 1836. He pursues medical studies at McGill University. He graduates in 1860. Before coming out west to Victoria, he hears about the gold rush that's happening and comes out to what is then the colony of Vancouver Island, before Vancouver Island merges with the colony of British Columbia to form one colony, and then one colony becomes a province. No, it's complicated, but he comes out first to the colony of Vancouver Island. And he serves in many different roles. He starts off with a medical profession, and then he quickly becomes a politician, where he advocates for Canada, British Columbia as a unified colony to join Canada in Confederation. So he does that in the early to mid 1860s, and then in 1872, he's invited by his friend, John A. Macdonald, to serve as the superintendent of the newly formed Department of Indian Affairs of British Columbia. So he works for the federal government out here in British Columbia and BC. And he accepts this position and he holds this important post from 1872 until 1889, where he is ill, he retires from that, and then he gets better and he goes into real estate before dying in 1915. But it's his time during his tenure as superintendent of Indian Affairs where he plays a pivotal role in implementing many policies aimed at assimilating Indigenous peoples and clearing the way for capitalist development and Canadian nation building. He was handpicked by Macdonald to be a voice out on the West Coast to facilitate that process. And here again, I'm just talking a bit about what's on the city's website to get us going. So in this position, he's involved in undermining Indigenous cultural practices such as the potlatch. He oversaw the hiring and management of Indian agents in the province, which sought to implement federal Indian policy in different parts of the province. He was involved in reserve making, facilitating land speculation, including here in Tla'amin territory. He also removed many sacred and ceremonial objects from Indigenous communities, again, including here in Tla'amin territory, to put into museums for the curiosity, profit, and entertainment of people around the world. So overall, the city's website underscores that Powell promoted and implemented a whole host of assimilationist policies that sought to undermine and attack the group life of Indigenous nations to facilitate socioeconomic development and nation building. This is a pretty uncontroversial part of the history of Powell. Powell isn't alone. Many different officials were doing similar things in different parts of the country. But to be clear, Israel Wood Powell played an important role in implementing settler rule in British Columbia. And I know at the outside that some might be thinking, well, Powell was actually more sympathetic than some of his contemporaries. And then this logic gets used to suggest that Powell is thus being unfairly targeted. And then this gets extended to, well, then the city shouldn't be considering the name change, right? He wasn't as racist as some other people. So let me clarify just before I get going how this reasoning relies on confused logic. So first, Powell's reports to the Department of Indian Affairs, which I've examined carefully, and I'm going to give you some examples today and that are published in the paper for you to read, do in fact contain a lot of anti-Indigenous racism, very similar to people like Trutch and others. So that argument falls apart very quickly when you actually look at what he is saying in his reports. But simply because Powell did not express the same level of anti-Indigenous racism as some of his contemporaries does not mean, and this is the really important part, that he was less complicit in administering the colonial project to the great detriment of Indigenous peoples. Quite the opposite is true, as I'm going to show today. That's the core issue. But one key aspect of Powell's legacy here, his complicity in colonial schooling, is only mentioned briefly in the report. So there's more to know on this subject, and my talk today offers a detailed examination of Powell's involvement with colonial schooling in British Columbia, which I think needs to be very carefully considered in this moment. So rather than being a marginal figure in this story, Powell, as BC's first superintendent of Indian Affairs, helps lay the foundation for colonial schooling targeting Indigenous people in the province. Specifically, he played a pivotal role in expanding the residential school system to British Columbia, clearing the path for the creation of the Kamloops and Sechelt residential schools that directly affected Tla'amin children and families. As well, Powell helped the Indian day school system to take root in British Columbia, which the Tla'amin Indian Day School was a part. And he also promoted public schooling for settler children as a tool to be used to strengthen settler rule in British Columbia, to justify the process of colonialism as natural, inevitable, and unquestionable. As Powell stressed to the Department of Indian Affairs in 1876 in his report, when speaking specifically of schooling targeting Indigenous people, he says, barbarism can only be cured by education. But let's back up. Before being appointed as BC's first superintendent, Powell, as I mentioned, was a doctor and an influential politician in Victoria, but he was also a school promoter in the 1860s. And in terms of public schooling specifically, Powell, like other notable colonists at the time, such as Amor de Cosmos, argued that expanding public education for settler children was necessary for building the colony of British Columbia. Though public schooling is generally thought to be a progressive social good at today, early colonial schooling was used by the government to facilitate colonization and legitimate settler rule. In fact, many parents didn't want to send their children to the schools. The government had to pay the entire cost and gradually convince parents over time to have their children educated by the state. Their argument was that settler children needed to learn how to become effective colonists. And public schools became important sites for teaching pupils key lessons in colonial legitimacy, including learning racist and dehumanizing narratives that degraded Indigenous people to justify colonization as not only necessary, but something that settler children had the right to continue to participate in. These lessons taught settler children that the building of Canada was necessary, benevolent, and enlightened even, divine in a Christian sense. Something that settlers should accept unquestionably. In this way, anti-Indigenous racism was learned and still is learned, precisely because it plays a role in protecting the colonial status quo. So the advocacy of school promoters such as Powell helped politicians and settler parents accept public schooling, funded and administered by the government, as a normal and crucial part of the colony's infrastructure, as key to the future of the colony as roads, bridges, and hospitals. It also helped attract new colonists to the West Coast, rather than going to Australia or New Zealand or South Africa or other parts of the British Empire. So how is this connected to Powell's work as the superintendent? Well, when British Columbia joins Canadian Confederation in 1871, and Powell becomes the first superintendent in 1872, he brought the idea that schooling was an effective tool to the work that he was doing as the federal government's primary agent of colonization on the West Coast. Powell, like many others at the time, believed that Indigenous people could be targeted and taught to accept colonization in new schools separate from settler children. Isolating Indigenous children from, quote, what he calls the corrupting influences of family and community was necessary as part of this process. As he explains in 1876, quote, I've got this on the slide here, to interfere materially with irregular habits and customs incident to life in the wigwam, the destruction of which is so necessary ere the much desired higher life can be obtained. So the building of Canada, the building of British Columbia, the making of British Columbia also was dependent on the destruction of Indigenous ways of life. So part of Powell's vision for building British Columbia as a settler capitalist society was the undermining of Indigenous lifeways and culture, which rooted them in the land, which they wanted for extraction purposes and to build wealth. It's, again, an uncontroversial part of the British Empire's legacy. It's just uncomfortable to think about it, and that's not how we learn about the building of the country that we live in. So indeed, far from being a peripheral concern, schooling was at the center of Powell's plan for wresting control of the vast and varied province of British Columbia from Indigenous peoples for settler benefit in the late 19th century. Now, even though he was appointed lieutenant colonel in the militia, right, he even wore his military uniform to the office to push paper because he believed that it gave him a greater air of authority, especially when dealing with Indigenous communities, that his uniform was part of the intimidation of his role. Powell actually desperately wanted to avoid conflict with Indigenous nations. This, however, should not be interpreted as proof of his benevolence, his enlightened position. Rather, like James Douglas, who was the first governor of British Columbia, and other colonial officials before him, Powell feared the costly outbreak of war with Indigenous nations that the government couldn't afford. Canada doesn't have a military at the time, and he's afraid that the government of British Columbia's more brazen, kick down the door, diplomacy at the barrel of the gun approach would actually risk creating conflict that would allow Americans to use that conflict as justification to intervene and take over the area. This is one of the big concerns of James Douglas, and Powell takes up this kind of strategy. So he prefers suasion as a softer and cheaper strategy for growing colonial power and influence in the region, right? He's getting good advice from Ottawa. This was Ottawa's perspective, which is why the federal government and the provincial government here in the late 19th century is often at loggerheads. Federal government is saying the way that you take over this area is through treaty, through negotiation, through diplomacy, through working nation to nation. And people like Trutch are like, no, that's expensive and annoying. We don't want to do that. We'd rather just show up with cannons and conflict. That's why they pick Powell as a representative, someone who thinks that Canada should be built differently and the interactions with Indigenous people should go through this other process. So what are the strategies of softer forms of colonialism? Schooling, not just in the British Empire, but also in the French Empire, the Spanish Empire, is used as a tool of that softer rule. Undermining rather than taking over by force. In this regard, Powell was already familiar with boarding schools for Indigenous people. He didn't come up with the idea, okay? Boarding schools for Indigenous people that were run by Christian missionaries had been in operation in British Columbia since the 1860s, such as Metlakatla on the northwest coast, but also St. Mary's here in the Fraser Valley, and now what is Mission City. And in consulting with missionaries who are already running these kinds of boarding schools, Powell was convinced that new funding from the federal government could help expand this missionary educational enterprise into a national system. So rather than the Catholic Church running a school here or there, and the Methodists running one here or there, the Anglicans over here, that if the federal government offered funding, you could create a national system and get more control over it. And things could be administered in a more organized way rather than as a haphazard approach. So far from the residential school system being imposed on British Columbia, Powell and others began suggesting a cost-sharing agreement between church and state to create this more organized system that was better funded, that could target Indigenous peoples. And this becomes the financial framework for the official Indian residential school system in the 1880s. So far from Powell just being a one-way transmission from Ottawa to BC, he's actually going, he's sending people like William Duncan out to Ottawa. He's corresponding saying, listen, if you come up with a funding agreement, this might make the system more financially manageable. As well, Powell's support for colonial schooling and land dispossession need to actually be understood as being interconnected and enmeshed, not separated out. We sometimes think, like, let's look at the bad things on their own. But we need to remember that when he's sitting in Victoria and he's getting correspondence, it's about land, it's about school, it's about cultural products, etc. They're all coming in through him, and he understood all of these different aspects as being necessarily linked. So as part of the government's machinery for colonization, to use his own term, Powell believed that creating reserves for Indigenous people, many of whom he believed were, quote, savage and uncivilized, unquote, was necessary so that the quote unquote heathen population could be more easily managed and children could be more easily targeted for the purposes of schooling. So these policies overlapped, reducing Indigenous mobility so that they could be more easily targeted by Indian policy. And then you create Indian agents who would make sure that there was a government authority in different communities or close to communities to make sure that this was all proceeding as Powell wanted and as he was getting directives from Ottawa to do. And as part of this larger process, the Tla'amin were forcibly removed and relocated by the government to 6 reserves in the 1880s. All of this is happening at the same time and under Powell's watch. While some defend Powell's approach to reserve allocation as being perhaps more enlightened than his contemporaries, his end goal of facilitating settler capitalism for Canada's benefit was very clear. As I've got here on the slide so you can read it, he says, "There is no doubt where everything is held in common, aspiration and thrift have no stimulus, no reward. Individual progress is hampered, if not rendered impossible. Barbarous customs which destroy individuality are still encouraged, and the labor and expense of inducing them to cultivate their own lands are generally bestowed in vain." Right? He's lamenting that Indigenous culture is more collective than individual, and so it needs to be undermined from within so that you can replace it with a different kind of modality, a way of individually thinking about profit rather than the collective, and that schools can play a role in undermining that collectivity. So again, the goal of containing and transforming Indigenous people are connected. And land policies and schooling overlapped as a result. One informed the other. And we see this most obviously in Powell's advocacy for new residential schools to be established in the province. So by the early 1880s, Powell began to strongly advocate for industrial training for Indigenous children at boarding schools that could more effectively intervene, right, and separate children from the influence of their parents and communities, facilitate assimilation, and transform them into, quote, more useful members of British Columbia's emerging settler capitalist society. You can start to see how all of these things start to become intertwined more clearly. As inspiration, he drew on the Indian boarding school system in the United States, which was established earlier. These were basically manual labor institutions teaching children how to work in a capitalist society. So that's one model. And then he also uses missionary William Duncan's Metlakatla settlement and its school as another model. And this is the Metlakatla school here on the right. So Powell calls on the Department of Indian Affairs in Ottawa to financially support the expansion officially of the Indian residential school system, which had been started in the prairies in 1883, out to British Columbia. And the first industrial school to open, well, it's already open, but to get the new federal funding to qualify as being part of this new national system is Metlakatla in 1889, which is the year that Powell retires from his position. And to be very clear, he had been already helping to support financially this school and other schools before the official residential school system was started in 1883. In 1890, based on Powell's advocacy related to site selection, 3 new schools were established, residential schools were established in the province. One in Cranbrook, another in the interior in Kamloops, and then one closer to here at Cooper Island. Some citizens of the Tla'amin Nation attended the Kamloops residential school in its earlier days before the Sechelt School was established in the early 1900s. Powell also worked with missionaries at other locations before official schools came online to develop the institutions that eventually would become recognized as residential schools at Port Simpson, Chilliwack, and Alberni. Though Powell helped establish the framework for state-funded and church-run residential schools in British Columbia, he also helped other forms of colonial schooling take root on the West Coast. For example, Powell oversaw the expansion of the Indian day school system which operated on the same church-state model and had the same objectives. And this is an image of the Indian Day School in Alert Bay in the 1880s, where my family member is from. And this is a time-lapse map I created with a colleague of Indian Day Schools across Canada, showing from the beginning of the system in the 1860s, 70s to the year 2000, where the last school closes out in Mohawk territory near Montreal. And we need to see the residential school system and the Indian Day School system as being twin parts of the same assimilative assault on Indigenous peoples through the tool of schooling. And while most children returned home at the end of the school day, Indian Day Schools still focused on assimilating Indigenous people, of undermining Indigenous lifeways and cultures to facilitate colonization. And many pupils, including here in British Columbia, report experiencing abuse and mistreatment at the hands of missionaries. Often missionaries worked in a day school, then they went to the residential school, and then they came back to the day school. These systems are overlapping rather than separate. And Salaman Indian Day School here, run by the Catholic Church, opened in 1908, and it ran until the 1960s as part of this larger network. Though advocating for day schools, Powell lamented the lack of total control over children who attended these schools and complained that their time away from school minimized the efficacy of the lessons and the assimilative power. He said, quote, "The Indian who's been subjected to such teaching in day schools, if indeed he's experienced any interruption in his listless habits and nomadic ways, soon resumes them, and the impressions made upon the child or youth are quickly lost." So he prefers residential schools. The problem is that they're expensive. They don't have the capacity to have as many children. So he sees day schools as a stopgap. And sometimes children would start in a day school, then they would go to a residential school, or they started at a day school, a residential school, and then they went back to a day school. So these systems are intermeshed. They play different parts of the larger project. And by the time Powell retires, there are 12 Indian Day Schools in operation across the province. And by the turn of the 20th century, the system of colonial schooling that Powell helped put in motion had firmly taken root and was taken up and expanded by other officials. By the early 20th century, there were 9 boarding schools and 17 day schools in British Columbia. It doubles very quickly based on the foundation that Powell helped put in place. And in total, there were 112 day schools in the province. And together, these schools played a role in Canada's assault on Indigenous people to facilitate colonization and nation building. Just one part of it, but an important part. Okay, I think we've gone through this once. Yeah, okay. Okay, now I'm going to offer some concluding thoughts on what we might do with this knowledge, how we might make sense of Powell's legacy in the light of some of this new research. So as part of the process of reflecting on Powell's legacy and considering possible changes to public commemoration, things that I've been learning and hearing about, from the name, the mill, the city of Powell River, to the many local institutions and businesses, including the library here, that reference either Powell or Powell River, Israel Wood Powell's complicity in supporting genocidal schooling at least needs to be acknowledged. As the TRC notes in its final report, public memory is dynamic. It's not fixed, but changes over time as new understandings, dialogues, artistic expressions, and commemorations emerge. Public memory, they argue, much like national history, is often contentious. Although public memory can simply reinforce the colonial story of how Canada began with European settlement and became a nation straightforwardly. The process of remembering the past together, like we're doing here, also invites people to question this limited version of history and reimagine what might possibly come after. Reckoning with the truth about colonial schooling, the colonial past generally, is hard but important work. Names matter. And the residents of the city of Powell River here, like Canadians across the country, including where I'm from in Winnipeg, Manitoba right now, have the opportunity to follow the TRC's lead and demonstrate leadership on these issues. You can decide whether you want your city's name to continue to reinforce colonial values and celebrate consciously or unconsciously a figure complicit in genocide, or whether you want to work with the Tla'amin Nation to determine the best way forward, develop more meaningful and respectful relations for the future, for you folks, for your children, and their children. And to be really clear, I'm not here today to tell you what to do. That's not my role. I want to be respectful as a guest. Instead, what I want to do is thank you for your attention, for showing up on a Saturday afternoon, for packing all the way down the hall on both sides, for those of you who have joined us online, to learn more about the information about this, to learn more about who was Israel Wood Powell, and what was his relationship to the origins of settler colonial rule in British Columbia, so that everyone involved can learn and make an informed decision about what the next steps might be. As Murray Sinclair, the chair of the TRC, who I showed you earlier on the slide, says, education is what got us into this mess, but education and the courage to use that knowledge for good is what will get us out. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks very much, Sean. We've got quite a bit of time left for questions. So what I'm going to do, sorry, I feel like I'm in everybody's way. We're going to take questions. Put myself in the way. So we're going to take questions from the room. We don't have the ability to take questions online. So if you are watching online and you have questions, I invite you to email Sean directly. He's shared his information. You can also email VIU, and VIU will pass your questions on to Sean that way as well. So if you're online, thanks for your patience. And if you're in the room, we're going to try to get to as many questions as we can. So we appreciate brevity in your questions, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. I need your help. So I'm going to be walking down the aisle with a mic, and I'm going to pass the mic down because I want to make sure that everybody can hear the questions. So I'm going to pass this mic down the row. So if you're in the row, I'm going to be passing it down. Help me out. And then once you've asked your question, please pass it back so I can get to the next person right away. Okay. Okay. Thanks very much. And we got the first question here.
Teamwork, right? It works great.
Yeah, hi, thank you for your well-devised speech that you gave today. And the words I picked up the most were communism and anti-Semitism. Clearly Israel Powell is Jewish. Nobody would name their child Israel and not be Jewish. I couldn't even begin to imagine that. So the other part to that is, are you advocating communism and anti-Semitism? And third to that, have you studied the Blue Quills story at all in Alberta? Thank you.
Thank you. Sean, if you don't mind just answering the second question.
Yes. That I've heard about Blue Quills in the 1970s. There was a struggle over the community, control of that particular school. I know that Blue Quills, this is in Alberta, for those of you unfamiliar, was occupied by members of the community who wanted to reclaim that school to ensure that the education that they had been asking for from the federal government was being used for community priority, right? that education was something that many Indigenous communities wanted, but they did not ask for residential schooling that separated them from their families. In fact, in much of the numbered treaty negotiations, what they were asking for was resources as treaty partners for education that they would be able to use in their own communities for the benefit of their members. So thanks for your question.
I have a question for you. I was up in Queen Charlotte City and I was talking to people because they went through the name change and it was very divisive at first. And then they figured out a way that they could process it. And at the end of the day, they did change the name. But are there examples across the country? Because it would be useful because we don't want conflict. We want to find a way of building. Obviously, it's better the more people in the community can support change, the better it is for everybody. Are there other examples across the country that you would know of that people here could learn about, who could say, how do you do this in a way that, because sometimes, you know, if you just attack, then others react. And then the question is, how do we build something because in the end, we would like the strongest possible support for whatever comes out of this, right? So I just wondered if you knew of others.
Yeah, good question. I mean, we know even Haida Gwaii, right? It used to be called Queen Charlotte Islands, right? There are lots of examples just in BC of a lot of this happening. And, you know, I mean, I was saying this morning that I currently live in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. All three of those words are Indigenous words, 2 Cree words, 1 Mohawk word, right? The name of our country is Kanata, meaning village in Mohawk. So this argument that like I couldn't possibly pronounce Indigenous names, you just need to learn. It's about the education piece. But in order to do that, you need to take seriously the idea of building relationships with the people who speak different languages, right? That respect historically has not been there because you don't colonize people you respect. That's that learned dehumanization that I was talking about that was taught informally, of course, at the pub, community center, in your church basement, but also overtly in schools. I studied the history textbooks in British Columbia from 1920 to 1970 to learn about some of the colonial knowledge that my teachers and me learned. And I think most people would be very surprised when they actually look at some of that information. That kind of disrespect is learned. All I think this moment offers us is an invitation to unlearn some of that and find ways to build better relationships. I'll give you another example. In Winnipeg, Manitoba, we have part of a highway that was named after Bishop Grandin. Bishop Grandin was an influential church official who was in correspondence with people like Powell and the Department of Indian Affairs to establish the residential school system. We recently had a community process whereby we decided whether that was appropriate. We decided something else would be suitable. A new name has been changed. The city is learning. Google Maps is figuring out how to implement that. And I would say that the process, sorry, this is a little staticky. The process has actually, I think, brought the community together in ways of figuring out how we can do this in ways that doesn't feel threatening. It's not about taking something away from you. It's actually about learning. And if we can do that and find ways to bring people into that knowledge and to use this as an opportunity to strengthen relations, I think I'm not here to tell you what to do, but other parts of the country are doing exactly that. It's hard. There are many people that are resistant. But engaging meaningfully and trying to build those partnerships by coming out to the public library on a Saturday to learn more about information that you can use to ensure that we're having meaningful conversations, that's an important piece. It's going to require some effort though, right? Maurice Sinclair always says that this is an intergenerational project. The harm was created over many generations. Undoing it and figuring out better ways to relate to one another is going to take some time too. doesn't happen always overnight or in the ways that we think it will. But if we look to other examples of people that are doing this in positive ways, I mean, the country of New Zealand has two names. One of them in Maori. So there are examples out there of people who have engaged in this process, who've worked through some of the tensions that are involved in relearning, changing the way you think about yourself and the place that you live, developing better relations that we might lean on. I'm happy to give more examples if you want to send me an email about that. But thanks for your question.
Oh, hello. Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. This has been fantastic. I believe the difference in the example that Rick gave was Dajin Yeats was a name reclamation. That place had a name that was very well known, and so that's a little bit different than exactly what we're talking about here. This place also has been named different things. That's not really my point. I just wanted to clear that up for folks. Okay, my question to you is, in my own personal history dives of this man, Israel Wood Powell, I have a really hard time finding things that speak to his character. And we're talking about a time when people wrote letters daily, weekly to other people. Very little correspondence about this man, very little to bring up to know about him, aside from he's a doctor, he had these roles in the government, he didn't really want the job. You know those stories, those are very prominent. So can you speak to that at all?
I can, but first, another quick point on your first point of clarification. You know, one of the things I find interesting about the name change conversations is part of what's hidden in this conversation is the fact that, I'm sorry that this is giving us so many issues. I'll use my teacher voice to get that organized very quickly. So we need to understand that sometimes what gets left out of these conversations about name change is that part of the process of colonization was changing all of the names for everything, so that settlers could more easily pronounce. Sorry, but it was also maybe I'll use this mic. Thank you. It was also part of the process of establishing power and control. That renaming places was part of that colonial project of legitimizing and normalizing that project. So the opportunity today is to perhaps unthink that and reestablish better relationships through that process. So yes, the reclaiming of names is one thing, the developing new names for things, you know, it's a different but related process. Okay, on Powell's character, a couple of points. One of the things that surprised me is, given Powell's importance, there is actually a lack of historical writing about him. That's one of the hard parts of doing this work, right? It also ensures that misinformation about Powell can be kept intact, because there's actually not a lot of easily accessible resources for people to learn about this. So 2 points. One of the things that I've done is that the BC Archives down in Victoria actually have a set of his journals that I think gives us a better sense of his character. Now, on a related point, one of the things is that often learning more about these folks is somewhat disappointing, because people often go to look to think, okay, someone supporting genocidal schooling must be some kind of boiling blood monster. But in reality, most people who were colonial officials were doing it for the money. Duncan Campbell Scott, has anyone heard of Duncan Campbell Scott? He was Superintendent General of Indian Affairs in the early 20th century. He was ever a penny pincher. He said some terrible things, saw kind of children as collateral damage in the colonization process. But he was really getting into it because he wanted money to fund his poetry. He used, I'm not joking. He used his position because he wanted something stable, and he administered genocide in the day, and he wrote poetry at night. Nicholas Flood Davin. Has anyone heard of Nicholas Flood Davin? He was a reporter, kind of a failed politician out in Regina. He wrote a report in 1879 recommending that the Macdonald government devise this national system of residential schooling. Okay, also a poet, and wrote a lot of anti-Indigenous racist poetry. So, you know, I mean, that's kind of weird, but we tend to want to look to these people as if they're, you know, foaming at the mouth, that they're some kind of monsters. But often the more banal fact is that they administered genocide for money, for a job, because they wanted to undermine Indigenous lifeways so that they could find new land and make money. I mean, Paul literally came out here for the money. He came, like many people, Amor to Cosmos, many of the builders of British Columbia came for the gold. And when the gold didn't work out, they found something else. Politics, gain power, build a new society that would benefit them. And I think that that kind of realization that these people aren't that different than ordinary Canadians. It's just that their job was to administer this project to subtly shift power away from Indigenous peoples in favor of colonists like themselves for their own benefit. And their ancestors today want to maintain that power, privilege, and profit precisely because it benefits them. But we don't need to do that. That's the good news. That's a choice. It's a learned choice. And some people have a hard time understanding that. But it is a choice. That's not the only way that you can act in the world. We can build different ways of relating to one another and living with one another. And that's the invitation, I think, that we have at this moment.
Okay, so I got the next question right beside me. Then I'm going down this row, then I'm going up the side, and then I know I've got 1, 2, 3 there. We got a bit of a queue, so we can keep the questions short. We'll get to as many as we can.
Hi, I'm Angela Young. My parents are Ron Mangan and Lynette Mangan. I'm a product of SD 47 as a high school graduate. I've returned back to SD 47, School District 47, to be a teacher. Chechahashquat Aman Kaimu, Esnete Gije. My question is for you as a university professor. I work in elementary schools, and I think I see the unlearning that is happening in our elementary schools with the BC curriculum around truth before reconciliation. I wonder if you could speak to the trends that you're noticing in your university classes of what high school students are coming to you and unlearning there.
Thank you very much for your question. 2 points. Let me think about my own experience as a BC K-12 student, and I'll connect it to my experience now as an educator in post-secondary. When I was in grade 11, I went to Argyle Secondary School in Lynn Valley, and there was a new course called, I'm gonna struggle with the name, I think it was called First Nation Studies. Anyone take that or know a little bit more about it? Anyway, it was an elective. And nobody took it because it was an elective. It was like self-selecting things that are going to challenge the way that you understand the world. And the teacher of that course was the rugby coach. I played rugby. And I remember him saying to me at one point, in 20 years, this is going to be different. Slowly but surely, there will be more people who are interested in learning about this. And in that moment, I remember thinking, nah, I don't think so. I didn't self-select the course. Fast forward about 20 years, I do think we are starting to see a monumental shift. Let me give you an example. My neighbor is a K-12 librarian, and she invited me last year to speak to her grade 4-5 class for I Love to Read Month. There's a thing where you go and you teach people that reading is fun kind of thing. And she asked me, given my area of expertise, if I could read from a story about residential schools and have a conversation with students about it. So I thought about it. I selected a book called Fatty Legs. Here we're in the public library. Has anyone read this? It's about a girl's young experiences. But before I started reading, I said to the class, just by a show of hands, how many people have heard of residential school? Everybody. That was way different than my experience. And I said, what do you know about residential schooling? This kid in the back puts up his hand. That's where I'd be sitting. Puts up his hand, and I'm thinking, oh boy, what have I opened? Maybe I should have just read the story. Kid in the back says, well, it was a church and state partnership that for over 100 years sought to separate Indigenous children from their families and assimilation. Now we have Orange Shirt Day. One of the elders in Winnipeg, Betty Ross, came to speak to the class. He knew her. They liked hockey. He liked that. And now we have an opportunity to build better relationships. And I thought, why am I here? To me, the difference between my experience 20 years ago of not knowing anything, if someone had asked me, I would have been like, residential what? To a grade 4 or 5, I didn't wear jeans in grade 4 and 5 because I couldn't figure out the buttons. And this kid is schooling people on basic knowledge about what this is and connecting it to, this is some of the work that we've been doing in our school to try and make better relations with the people that we live with. So to me, the youth are our answer. They get it. It's just us old folks battling these things out, right? Same thing in Winnipeg. There was a racist op-ed in our newspaper talking about how difficult it is for us to pronounce Indigenous words. And I went to this class and so who said Saskatchewan? Like all of these things, kids just learn it. Everything for them is about learning. They don't know any of these words that we take for granted. So as they grow up hearing this, understanding this more, to them it's second fiddle. And to me, that's, I think, that intergenerational argument that education in the end is going to win the day. Just take some time. Thanks.
Back here next, John.
Hello. Hi, my name is John. Thank you for your talk. Since we're just getting to know the man, I have a couple of interesting facts that I've written in my book called Keeper of the Red Cross. One is that years ago in a Victoria newspaper, there was an article stating him as keeper of the Holy Grail. I don't know if you knew that.
Yeah, this is like his Masonic influences.
Yeah. And that, and also that his bloodline relates back to the Sinclairs, which is a supposed holy bloodline. And I was wondering why you sort of excluded his doctor from his name. That's how I know him. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. I think it's also important to acknowledge our kind of limitations in knowledge. I don't know as much about his Masonic activities. I know he was very involved, and then he was less involved, and then just before his death, he becomes re-involved. I don't admittedly know a lot about the Masonic Lodge and his work there. I think I did say that he went to McGill, yeah, and he did medical studies and he created a medical practice. So he often actually liked to be called Lieutenant Colonel. So if we're being specific about what he wanted and how he addressed himself, he kind of leans out of the doctor part. Although, interesting fun fact, one of the things that Joseph Trutch didn't like about Powell is he thought he was lazy because he was working in his medical practice at the same time that he was the superintendent, which he thought was a conflict of interest. Trutch, despite his differences of opinion with Powell, wanted Powell to really get involved in the work of colonization. They thought that his attention to the medical practice was taking away from his work as superintendent. So that's maybe a small piece about how he juggled these two different things that he was doing.
Thank you. My name is Ann Harrison, and I was just going to follow up on the fact that we haven't talked about him as being a medical doctor. And, I mean, when you consider where we are with medicine today in our world and where they were then, for a McGill graduate to come to the West Coast and think that they could, or feel that they could maybe help in the health way, because that must be where he came initially as a medical doctor. I was surprised that we didn't that you didn't go into that a little bit more in your detail, but you've just started to explain that. And I think that's a very important part that we have neglected.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for your question. We also need to remember, if anyone's interested in looking more at the intersection of health and colonization, there's a good book. I'm sure you could work with the public library to get access to it. It's called Colonizing Bodies by Dr. Mary Ellen Kellum, who I know Liam knows, who was my supervisor, and often talked about the ways in which colonial officials were very focused on reforming Indigenous bodies through health to bring them on board to the colonial project. So that because someone was a doctor doesn't mean that they were enlightened, compassionate, etc. They were actually focused on transforming Indigenous bodies, protecting them in certain ways. One of the other people, just as a quick example of medicine, and how sometimes medicine can collide with colonial policy. We often hear, you can't critique the past by the values of today, right? Have you heard this? So one of my arguments is that people make that argument not knowing that there was always criticism of the Indian day school and residential school system from its early days in the 1880s to its end, including not just Indigenous parents, students, community members who colonial officials would constantly try and undermine, but also in 1907, the department's own medical expert, a guy named Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce, has anyone heard of him? A few people? Okay, he wrote a report in 1907 basically saying, look, a quarter of the children going to residential schools in Western Canada are dying. Okay? And what you need to do is improve the conditions in those schools so that they have better nutrition, they have better sanitation, better ventilation. And the Department of Indian Affairs, led by a guy named Duncan Campbell Scott, says that's going to be too expensive in 1907. And instead of getting that report and seeing the obvious consequences of the system, he doubles down on it, and the system expands after that. After all of the information that Canadians are shocked about learning today, right there in the 1907 document. And Peter Henderson Bryce essentially gets kicked out of the Department of Indian Affairs for continually pointing out that colonial officials are ignoring the dangerous health conditions of these schools, including medical officers in the schools. It's easier to think these schools were well-intentioned, we didn't know they were bad, then the system ended and now we're reckoning with it. That's not the narrative. That's not what the Department of Indian Affairs' own records suggest, is that people knew what was going on, but they were indifferent. Because the destruction, as Powell would say, of Indigenous lifeways benefits settler colonialism. The maintaining of the dysfunction that the system wrought also benefits continued colonization. Colonization isn't something in the past that we've gotten over. It's an ongoing process. And commemoration debates are just one slice of that, about shifting the balance of power to perhaps getting more people on board, trying to improve that relationship. So when we think of him as a doctor, right, people think of that as him being compassionate. And perhaps he did care about people. But when he realized what was going on in some of these schools, right, Indian affairs officials doubled down on that system. So that he was a doctor isn't some kind of smoking gun that he must have been a good person. That's what he was doing on the side. Yep.
Oh, sorry. Well, sorry. I forgot the mic.
Sorry, yep.
Yeah, you're not in charge. Question here. I'm doing my best. Okay.
Thank you very much, Sean. My name's Rob. And it's really reassuring to hear a teacher reaffirming my skepticism about school, which I had when I was younger and in school. My question to you right now is, can you speak to unlearning? My deep conviction is that this community is full of people who want to find our way forward and who are facing the challenge of divisiveness and assumptions that pull us apart. So how do we approach unlearning? If you can, as a teacher, and we know what teaching is about mostly, it's about putting knowledge into our brains. How do we unlearn so that we can truly invite what it takes to create something really new here?
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. Maybe I'll answer it this way, because I mean, I think I agree with you. I talk around the country, I talk to my students, try and get a pulse of what's going on. And I really think that the vast majority of people are interested in this, of learning and figuring out how to build better relationships. But sometimes we give a lot of oxygen to folks that are resistant for whatever reason, right? I gave a talk out in Southern Ontario talking about the legacy of Egerton Ryerson. And Ryerson's family showed up and they asked some silly questions and they were very confrontational. And I get it, right? It's like their ancestor. That makes sense to me. Or people who think, I don't know how to pronounce this other word. That makes me feel uncomfortable. So I want to double down on this easier to pronounce one that makes me feel better. I mean, I actually understand that. But here's the thing. In terms of unlearning, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission offers us a very easy to understand formula. First, we have truth. Truth will lead to healing. There's lots of healing that needs to be done. Healing will lead to justice. Justice will lead to reconciliation. And there are some people who understand that formula very clearly and would rather keep us stuck in the quibbling about the truth, undermining the truth to protect their power and privilege so that we don't have to do the healing, justice, and reconciliation part. But hey, but here's the thing. Part of my job as an educator, but also as a community member, is to figure out, I understand why that's the case. I get it. It can be scary. It can be unmooring. But how do we invite people into saying, listen, let's figure it out together? That part is also about learning. And if we focus on the folks that show up and want to do that work and not spend all of our time dealing with the folks for whatever reason are entirely resistant to it, they're going to lose. They're already losing. They just have lots of, oxygen. The National Post, True North, Western Standard, all of these far-right publications will publish it so that they can get money and get people worked up and try to stall that momentum. I don't even think the people who share that on Facebook and Twitter, et cetera, know they're part of the grift of that. They just share it because it makes them feel better. But we need to find ways not to push people aside, but to the best of our ability. And that means not everyone doing the same work, right? That this should not be falling on Tla'amin folks if they're not interested. Part of this is non-Indigenous people being like, John, I see that you're sharing this really weird Facebook post. What are you doing? Or at the hockey dressing room, right? When someone says, oh, these residential schools, I'm sick and tired of hearing about them. It happens. I know it happens because they let me into these spaces because they don't think I'm who I am. I know what people say behind people's backs. I've been there. I've listened to those conversations and said nothing. I know how that feels. Continuing to do that is not the answer. That actually hurts non-Indigenous people too. When you sit on your hands and you let racism like that, the denigration of the people that you work with, that hurts you too. So the investment in trying to figure out what are some good strategies, what do we need, what kinds of education, what kind of what kind of tactics and strategies do we need to reach out to folks and build the people that want to be part of this conversation? How do we do that? As I said at the end of the talk, I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm trying to give you some information to help you folks figure out the best decision. It's going to look different here than it looks like in Winnipeg, or it looks like in North Vancouver, or it looks like in Kamloops. And the TRC is really clear. Read volume 6. It lays it out. These debates are hard. But the benefit of this is it can actually build our communities stronger. Focusing on this division and keeping us stuck in this colonial status quo benefits only a small group of people. Thanks.
Great. Great. I have to release Sean at 3 o'clock. So I'm going to try to sneak in at least 3 more questions. I've got one here, and I know that he's been waiting for quite a while. Then I've got next in the 3rd row, and then I'm coming up. Okay, we'll do our best.
We can do a lightning round. That's fine. I'm happy.
Thanks, Liam. Chachayatach, Quinanape, Lisa Moffat Etnan. I'm a white person who lives here who just learned some Ayajutha worms. So it's very easy to do if you are willing to put the time in. I co-facilitated the name change process here. I hate public speaking. This will come as a surprise to some people. And a couple of observations that I made are when people are unable to visualize what the future is, they only think that the future could result in bad things. And so they operate from a place of fear. And that's compounded by guilt and shame that some of us have for the positions of power and the privilege and the ways that we benefit from colonial systems. And so in response to Rick Craig and some of the other questions in the room about how do we get through this is it's very uncomfortable. You have to face the fact that you benefit from these systems and you have to admit that you have privilege here, and it's what you do with that power and privilege that's going to help us move forward in these systems. I'm curious if you have any experience with that with people who've, kind of evolved their opinions over time and through that way.
Yeah, thanks so much for your question. I mean, I'm standing here today as someone who went through all of those steps. It's hard. This is not easy. The path can be difficult, but doing it together, this is the maybe inspiring part, is finding common cause with other folks in your community to work. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, but the ability to work together is always a win. Finding ways to think about whether we're talking about a name change, whether we're talking about a difficult decision about educational funding or a new park or what have you. But that it can be done. I'm sitting here right now as someone who 25 years ago didn't know anything and would have doubled down on all the weird stuff on Facebook because that's what my friends were doing. But as I learned more and talked to people about, okay, well, what do you do? How can you make mistakes and feel okay about making those mistakes? That's another thing. It's possible. It just takes time. But it also requires community. If you're doing it on your own and you don't have a support network, right? You don't build these relationships, it's not going to work. It's a collaborative process, and working together to build community in whatever context we're talking about takes time and it takes effort, but it's worth it because the reward of that, of building a better community that you live in, whatever it's called, is worth the work. And I commend you folks for being part of that, even when it's not easy.
My question is the connection between Powell and the potlatch. And was the potlatch a political event as much as it was a community event?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, I can't speak from an Indigenous perspective about what the potlatch meant or means today, but what I can talk about is how Powell saw the potlatch. And Powell and others saw the potlatch and other cultural ceremonies of Indigenous people, say on the prairies, there was the Sundance, okay? They saw these particular events as opportunities of exactly what I was just talking about, building collectivity and relationships that were connected through language and culture. It was a strengthening. They were opportunities to strengthen Indigenous communities, which is exactly why they wanted to undermine those practices. And what's interesting is that if you look into the history, some folks will point to Powell's reluctance to use the new powers of the Indian Act that he actually advocated for, because he was, again, that softer suasion strategy. He was worried that if all of a sudden he flexed the colonial muscle, that it would produce resistance. And he was more believing that if you slowly undermine Indigenous culture over time, right, that the consequences of that would mean that you wouldn't have to have the more muscular approach to it. That generation over generation, the potlatch would disappear, the Sundance would disappear, the languages would disappear. As a result, the connections to the land would disappear, and then you can use that land for profit. That was, colonizers are good at playing the long game, not just in the past, but in the present today too. And so his view about the potlatch was that eventually over time, these kinds of attacks on cultural practices and ceremonies would do its work. But you needed to be very careful. For example, the residential school system didn't have a mandatory attendance until 1920, which a lot of people don't know. Public schools in British Columbia for non-Indigenous children weren't mandatory until 1922, 1920 as well, same year. Why? Because the government was trying to convince both Indigenous and non-Indigenous parents that schooling that they controlled was in their best interest. And if they tried to force people to do it, that they would risk resistance. So there's a political strategy of trying to wait until you have more buy-in before you make something compulsory. And that was his sort of strategy around the potlatch ban, getting it into the Indian Act, and then using it slowly over time. He knew that he wasn't the only guy, that the work that he was doing would be continued by other people like Vowell who take over for him.
Hi, Sean. Thank you so much for your talk and for being here. I feel like what you just said is kind of a perfect segue for what I wanted to ask, considering his role in education and the education system and how that affects the education system today. I myself, along with some of my colleagues here, work with SD47, and I'm an Indigenous student and cultural support worker, aka CHEP or an auntie. And how do we distinguish education from the education system? Because if we're still delivering those systems, then how is it still up to us? And why is it still up to us? And why shouldn't that be something that's at large changed or altered, considering it has such a grand effect on our memory and how we remember? I mean, we've been taught to remember a certain way and to consider history a certain way and to hold on to certain facts. Like you mentioned about names and name changes, the idea of just erasure. So we've all been taught by the same system. I have faith in education. I don't know. Can you give me some faith in the system? I don't know. Thank you.
In 2 minutes or less, can I say?
2 minutes or less.
Okay, a couple of quick points. One, as an education historian, it's important to distinguish between education and schooling. So education as a way of informing members of a group to learn and live, right? All human societies have had some form of education. Schooling, as we think of it today, in four walls with straight rows of desks, learning from textbooks, prescribed curriculum from the government, this is actually a very recent phenomenon. We're only talking about, well, here, very recent, but even in the British Empire, in England, most working class people didn't get education until the 19th century, right? But they understood schooling, controlled by the government, prescribed curriculum as a way of colonizing minds, of teaching people ways to reproduce particular kinds of societies. That model gets replicated in the colonies and, creates the learning that we've been talking about. So I have a lot of faith actually in education. Education is the answer. Schooling, however, is more complicated. I firmly believe we work with the institutions that we have. So we try and make those institutions as safe as possible to use them for their own work. But I do think, sorry, was it Rob? I do think we have lots of work to do to think about how we unlearn schooling or deschool schooling and figure out what kinds of institutions we need to teach our youth about building relationships and living in ways that are more gentle, more sustainable, all of these kinds of things. I mean, it's so funny to me as an education historian, or schooling historian, maybe I should say, that in the 1860s and 70s, the government of British Columbia, I know I see Liam looking at me being like, you might not get home if you continue, but I'm gonna say it and I'll be quick. That in the 1860s and 1870s, the provincial government was maybe not sold on the fact that schooling was gonna take root. They were thinking that parents were gonna be like, no, we educate our children based on the values that we have, okay? So now, fast forward 150 years or so, this idea that like we can't think of anything outside of this box of schooling is kind of wild, right? People like Pavel would be like, job done. I have helped normalize schooling as the only way that people can learn. And I have normalized government control over that. I wrote a whole book about this that, you can get the public library, don't buy it, don't waste your money, get the public library to do it and share it. That I think, that part of the work, we've got lots to talk about, I think.
I'm so sorry to cut this off. I know.
My email is right there. Please send me an email. We'll help.
Who's gonna fly him home?
Thank you, Sean. That was really interesting and I learned a lot. And I'm also familiar with most of the archival work and also with New Zealand and Australia. My question is this. We talk about how we're going to move forward together. And I suspect you're preaching to the choir mostly here. My concern is who is not here. They are in our community and they need to be taken into account. But we use terms like we set them aside, they answer silly questions, and then we call them racist. They may be, they may not be, but I think all the changes that move forward must have a better, more cohesive way of doing it than creating dueling opinions that have led to a great deal of divisiveness in this town. And I'm not happy to accept that there's only one way to go here. And I think I speak for a lot of people who probably will never come here. So how do we address that?
Yep, thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much. I mean, I think there were some folks that were here that kind of sleeked out at the back. My honest answer is, look, the work is difficult. We're not all going to agree on what we should do, what the future should look like. But one of the bases of comparison, thanks, Liam, one of the things that we do have in common is that the truth of who Israel Wood Powell was and what he did is there. And we need to figure out ways to how can we use that history to have conversations with people who might not agree with us about what we should do with the history. So let's focus on what we do have in common. That this is the truth as the archival documents show us in his own words. Let's do that part first and use that to then establish those relationships of, you can have debates with people who say gravity doesn't exist or the earth is flat. But gravity is there. No, I won't throw it. So I think that that's the basis of conversion, the basis that we can build on is that common learning process of first understanding the truth. Let's work together on that because we can probably agree for the most part on that. And then from there, let's talk about the other pieces.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming to this event and for joining us online. I also want to mention that this conversation doesn't need to end right now, right? Sean has invited you to contact him directly. You can also contact VIU. We also have courses in Indigenous Studies and a new course that we've just launched called Discovering Your Relationship to Ayajutham, which is directly related to this. We have two instructors, Amir and Ace, who are here. So, continue whatever learning looks like for you. Please, take initiative and do that. Thanks to the tech for making this all possible. Yeah, there was a lot of tech going on in this room today, and it went really well. And to all the volunteers from VIU for helping with the logistics today. We're also going to have more events like this in the future, so stay connected, please, to VIU so we can tell you about what's next.